folks, welcome back to the Metal Mill 52 workshop. My name is Bill. This is my shop. We're working on an LBSC TICH locomotive. This is the locomotive itself. There's the book that we're using, and it's a 3.5 inch gauge live steam locomotive. This week's episode we're going to cover several things that I had to fix, and also trying to get it to run really smooth on the low pressure. So you'll see all that. I covered, there's three kind of design flaws, if you ask me, about the fittings that have to do with the motion assemblies. So I go into detail in this episode about the fixes that I made for those. Also, I corrected the lubricator pump arm that wasn't working properly. So all three of those things are covered in this week's episode. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If you don't have questions but want to keep motivating me, just give me a thumbs up. I do appreciate that. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks everybody. Hope all the dads out there had a great Father's Day, and I hope everyone celebrates and commemorates the significance here in the States of Juneteenth tomorrow. So have a great week, everyone. Alright, here we go with the ball valve is almost completely closed. And you can tell it's a little bit slower RPM than it was, which is a good sign for it to be running, sounding pretty consistent at a low RPM. Just noticed another problem here. My ratchet is not moving. I have to adjust the ratchet on the lubricator. Here's a complication that's worth knowing about for future builders. I had fixed some of the binding problems, and I was letting it run slowly and run in like you saw in the previous segment. What I hadn't done yet was to make jam nuts for these fasteners here, or to put Loctite on the little flathead screws that hold the bushings in. I stopped it. It hadn't even jammed, but I stopped it, and I noticed that this looked funny here. The washer was still in place, the little steel washer. However, the flathead screw head was missing. It had fallen out. Which first I thought, well, that's not a big deal. Then I realized, well, it is a big deal, because the dang thing is broken off. There's probably about 1/8 of an inch of broken 256 screw inside the little stud there. So I really have no choice at this point but to drop the front axle. Luckily it's not too complicated. I have to take the connecting rods off both sides, drop the front axle down, and then I'll be able to either mill out, or 256 is awfully small for an easy out, but maybe a 1/16 inch carbide end mill, maybe I can just peck and make space and then re-tap the hole there. So we'll see. Pretty aggravating though. Well, it's relatively easy to get the axle assembly out, thankfully. Easier than I thought it was going to be. The rear one would be a little more difficult because of all the stuff on there, plus it would affect the timing. Happily the front one is not too bad. So here you can see that's the broken part. This is the one that's not broken and threaded. These are studs that are pressed in. I did not make these assemblies, so I don't know if they pressed them in or Loctited them in. But if I can't peck out the broken screw and re-tap it, I might be able to somehow press the little stud out from the back. It'll be a tricky operation too, but it's another thought. Press it out and just press in a new one. So let's see. I'll put the axle assembly on the mill. Even with this heavy-duty clamping, it still did vibrate a little bit when I used the 1/16 inch end mill to mill the screw out, but it did seem to work out good. I've got definitely a 1/4 inch or more of clearance there, so pretty happy about that, and I'll get ready to re-tap it 256 now. After studying the dilemma with the screws for the retaining washers on the front, I decided to go ahead and drill all the way through with a number 50 tapping size drill for the 256, and then tap as deeply as I could all the way. That lets me use a full length screw, like a 3/4 inch screw. Let me show you where to put it. or a half inch screw, 256 half-inch screw all the way through, which that and a little drop of blue Loctite, I think that will give me all of the gripping power. Before, for some odd reason, and according to the plans, the screws were like this size. That's what they said to make them. And so the original builder that had done the original machining on this had copied that, had followed it faithfully. And I guess if you're going to make a part that gets pressed in, it's better to have it solid rather than hollow. So I could see why, but in this instance, it seems like it's far better to have a whole half-inch of gripping power to hold that baby in. So we won't, hopefully that will solve the problem. We won't have that issue again. The next thing that I'm going to address is when Fred went through this, strangely enough there was a little sticking. It felt like it was on this side, and I'm pointing to the cylinder, and by taking all this stuff off I was able to rotate this through by hand, and sure enough, with the piston at the pretty much forward end of the cylinder, there was a little extra sticky or friction. So Fred suggested I take this apart and take a little turn or a little bit of the graphite wrapping off just to give a little smoother feel. So that's exactly what I'm going to do next. I'm not going to videotape that because it'll be pretty hard to do with holding a cell phone, but just wanted to point out that that's a good troubleshooting thing. You know, when I've never used graphited yarn as piston ring material before, and it's a learning experience to say the least. My big locomotive has cast iron rings, so that's the next thing I'm going to address is the graphite, and hopefully we'll get that smooth, get the friction out of it, and that will be almost all the things that need to get fixed. As far as the troubleshooting goes, hopefully to address the stickiness in this cylinder, I took the cylinder out, unscrewed all of this. It was no picnic, but not that bad. I also did have to remove this assembly in order to get the guide bar out, and I took off all that effort to take off one little teeny strand of graphited yarn packing material, and then I re-oiled it, packed everything in good with my fingers, slid the piston back in there, and now I'm reassembling. So wanted to show one thing I did too to make it possible to reassemble these crossheads, or the drive arms, whatever the proper name is. I ground a little flat on that round bolt head just to be able to be able to slip it out when the wheel is in place. So might be something a future builder might want to do to ease assembly and disassembly. I want to try to illustrate what I'm talking about. One of the cool things that having Fred help me troubleshoot this, we cycled this through by hand in the stand here, and felt the connecting rods and the drive rods and all that stuff at every step of the way to see if we could find any binding. And that's when, it's a long, laborious process, but that's when he found and decided that there was just it was a little bit too tight on this cylinder here, because there were sticking points that you really had to grab hard and twist. Now I've taken just that teeny little measly one, here it is, that showed again, like less than the size of a withered up, ground up worm or something, just a tiny bit of the graphite packing out, and look how smooth it is now, as smooth as silk. So the only thing I've got connected here is the one, the piston rod, the drive rod, and it goes all the way in and out very, very smoothly. So very excited about that. It's getting kind of late, but I'll start putting this thing back together tomorrow, and we'll get to run it on air again, hopefully very soon. Now that I've got the packing sorted out on the left-hand cylinder and the action is smooth, and also drilled out the fronts of the front axle, I'm getting ready to put the front axle back in, but one of the viewers asked me, Joe, this is for you, this is what the axle boxes look like. They're drilled out. These were already done when I got this set of parts. And so the holes are on top of both of them, the holes for the springs. I did a video where I showed where I wound my own springs, so you can check that out. And this is, what is it, page 17 of the book, shows the axle boxes. and the horn blocks in there. So hope that's helpful to you, Joe. I'm not going to video me putting this all back together, but just simply put, got to put the axle back. Oh, I know one thing I was going to show is a special tool for, it's a pain with these hex-headed screws, model size screws. One little trick that I've learned is you can use a large size hex head cap screw as a driver, basically like a nut driver. It fits right in there. So I'll be using that to reassemble. So I'll reassemble the axle, put the connecting rods back on, check that for smooth action overall, and then we can work on some kind of retaining nuts for these. I'll show that next. Okay, although it was no picnic taking all that stuff apart, it was definitely worthwhile, because look, let me flip it through here just with 2 fingers basically. Very smooth. There's oil all over everything. Let me try it with the other hand. So no real hard sticking spots. Goes smoothly through, you know. So very happy about that. So next thing I do before I run it on air again, there is an issue with the ratchet on the oil, the lubricator. I don't want to ruin the lubricator, so I'm going to take that drive rod off and take the lubricator out, and I can address that next. But I'll run it on air on some low pressure in just a minute and catch a video of that, show it to you. Okay, here we go with the locomotive running on air. It's less than 25 psi, and I got it throttled back with this little ball valve here. It's about as slow as I can get it. I'm going to try to step over here and see if I can slow it down a wee bit more, but this is after I made the, see, it's right there. It's a big ball valve. It's kind of the problem, I think. But that's a nice slow speed. I'm really happy I got rid of that friction, so thank you, Fred. Appreciate that. Next thing up on the agenda is to make some little jam nuts for the crossheads, and then reassemble the front axles with, put some Loctite in those screws there. Cut it off here and we'll see. Yep, they're holding steady. So these are I'm going to make double jam nuts here for these things. We'll see if that solves the problem on the crosshead bolts. Got the light shined on the 2 jam nuts I made to replace the existing nut on this side crosshead. Let me show you. I just made the 2 that will go on the other side. Here's the old nut. It's nice and wide. The only bad thing is they kept backing off, and that's a big problem. So what I did, I measured the length of the stud that sticks out. It's a little bit over 200 thou. So I made these 2 quarter-inch hex nuts about 100 thou thick, and you can crank them on and then twist them against each other like jam nuts, and they should hold in place. And so if you can see here, this one, so you can rotate the bolt so it's not binding the connecting rod, but it is, but they are holding steady. So I'm getting ready to replace the ones on the other side. I just thought I'd shoot a quick video, show you what I'm doing. I thought I had an issue with my lubricator, so rather than taking everything apart, what I did was I loosened the nut on the bottom of the lubricator line that goes to the steam inlet, and you can tell it's working because I just actuated the ratchet, and it's hard to see in this view, but you can definitely see it on my finger that there is steam oil oozing out of the line. So oil is getting to the bottom fitting. I think that the issue was that the stroke may not have been enough. So I'm going to play around with the push rod a little bit. And you can see it needs to move about 3/4 of the length of the case to move it a couple of teeth. So we'll play around with the push rod and see if we can't fix that problem. This will be the last segment of this week's episode. I'm pleased to report, after a lot of messing about with the rod and adjusting the lengths and the clevis positions and also moving the clevis on the actuating arm up to the shorter hole, I was able to get it to work properly. So resolve that issue, and stay tuned for further adventures of the Titch as we go along. Thanks. Please give me a thumbs up, ask any questions that you have, and appreciate it. Have a great week.